So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve.
Well, there's never been a time in our history when First Nations children have needed you more. And the good news is there's never been a time in history when you could do so much to change Canada's relationship between First Nations children from one of sadness, oppression, and apology to one of hope and inspiration and a better Canada. There's lots of talk about what reconciliation now, and people wonder what it means. But this is what it looks like. When non-Aboriginal and First Nations children stand together for the values that define our country the most. In fact, they define humanity the most. Justice, freedom, fairness, equality, and love. Children understand love and fairness in a way that many adults need to remember. As we grow older, we get this horrible habit of making the unfair moral. We rationalize things. In fact, we ask to be appreciated when we make even the smallest step toward doing the right thing, when children will say, no, that's still the wrong thing. You've still left a big gap. You know, people say that, who do you like spending the most time meeting with? And I like spending the most time meeting with grade 3 classes. I don't spend much time meeting with politicians because I find the grade 3 classes tend to make more sense. And you're going to understand why that is in just a minute. Now, here's the nuts of the problem. As you know, child welfare, education, and health laws apply on and off reserve all over the country. They have sadly displaced First Nations traditional systems of law, even when there's no evidence that the Western system is better. And that's the major problem, is that they can't prove that their option actually works for First Nations children. And there are people in this room who can tell you how those approaches have really contributed to the overrepresentation of First Nations children in justice, in child welfare care, amongst the poorest health indicators in the country. But as Sheila Fraser says, the federal government funds these services on reserve and does so to a far lesser level than all other Canadians enjoy. My friend Brenda Cope from the Mi'kmaq Nation explains it this way. She says, Canada builds 2 bridges for children. There's a bridge for non-Aboriginal children, and it goes over a very deep and fast-running river. And it's not as strong as a wealthy country like ours could make it. We all know that for every dollar you spend on a child, you actually save $7 as a country down the line, not to mention having a much healthier and productive and welcoming country for us all. But thanks to the resilience of children and their families and the services they do have, most make it over to adulthood to live the life of their dreams. And then there's the bridge for First Nations children. And that bridge only goes about 2/3 of the way over the river. Services in health and education and child welfare are only funded to about 75 to 80 cents on the dollar, even though First Nations communities are trying to recover from things like residential schools. And as First Nations peoples, or experts like Sheila Fraser, or allies in a non-Aboriginal community, yell back at Canada as our kids fall into the rapids of high suicide rates, of high child welfare rates, of the highest rates of tuberculosis. The government of Canada looks back at us and says, why aren't you thankful for the 2/3 of a bridge we built for you? And if pressed, they like to point to our need for governance and financial monitoring. And so that makes me wonder if financial mismanagement is a racial characteristic. And if that's true, I think that all of you, and please forgive me for this, but I think all of you will agree with me that no middle-aged white man in his 40s or 50s should ever head up a Fortune 500 company, a bank, or an investment firm after they tanked the worldwide economy in 2008, right? You know? So it's not that financial mismanagement and governance isn't an issue, it is. And it needs to be courageously addressed, but it's not a characteristic of us all, and it should never be used as a legitimization for racial discrimination against children. Some of you yesterday were like me and you were awaiting the federal budget. And you saw 500 pages of text there, and it can be pretty boggling, but it all adds up to this. Is another generation of First Nations children not being treated equally. Now the government is wanting to look for messages. We're supposed to be kind of acquiescent in saying, well, the $275 million over 3 years for First Nations education is a good first step. But the problem with the good first step is that that good first step has been taken for many years. And I was just reading a report in my office, 2 weeks ago. And this is what it says. Let someone hazard a guess as to what year or what century meaningful progress towards the equality of First Nations children will be made. That was 1967. It is 45 years later, and we are still at it. I told CBC this morning, I said, what I want to see is the Prime Minister come out with a duty as to when he's actually going to pony up and make things equal for First Nations kids. And even that date will be too long because there's a generation of kids right now growing up in the midst of this. There's no need to prove the inequality. Canada already knows about it. There are numerous reports on the shelves about how to deal with it. And we in the past, at least I can say I in the past, have spent far too much time in what I would call voluntary approaches. If I had another title for my talk, it would have been Beyond a Negotiating Table and Beyond a Roadblock. I would sit at negotiating tables with other talented First Nations folks in child welfare, and we would define the inequality. We would come up with the impacts on children. We would demonstrate how it could be fixed in very financially prudent ways, including with the help of great economists like John Loxley from your very own University of Manitoba. They would set it aside. They would say, we're waiting for a new government or a new opportunity. Another study would come, and I would sit at the table. And that happened until I actually ended up in India. And I was at Mahatma Gandhi's house, which has now been converted into a museum. And there's two types of museum goers. There's the person like myself who looks at the map for the hot 5 items and then does the quick beeline to the items and then is in the gift shop, right? And I don't know how many of you are like me, but let's go to the opening of the Human Rights Museum and we'll all collect around the gift shop. See who's in that category. And then there's museum goer number 2. And that is the person who walks in and they get the headphone thing, right? And you can see them at art galleries and stuff, and they're nodding their heads as they're listening to the thing, and they read all the plaques, and it takes them about 7 days to get through that. So I happened to be with my friend, and he was a 7-dayer in terms of that. So I was clearly out of the museum, and even out of the gift shop by the time. And there's a janitor leaning against the doorway, and a maintenance person, and he asked me what I did, and I told him, you know, like, and I'm shy, as you can tell, and I don't talk very much, so I was telling him all about this negotiation with the government of Canada, and why isn't it they aren't doing the right thing? You know, we prove this time and time again, these kids are growing up, like, what is it, what are we missing here, right? Well, that went through a whole cigarette to tell that story, right? You can time public presentations in minutes or cigarettes. This was a 1 cigarette story, and he threw it down and he pressed it into the sand. And he said, so tell me, how long have you been at this already? And I said, oh, it must be like about 10 years. It felt like about 5 lifetimes. And he said, why is it that every time you go to them, you do all these things, they give you the same response, and then you do the exact same thing again, and you expect something different. He said, you know what, I think you need to go back through the museum. Because you need to understand that government doesn't create change, it responds to change. And he said, you missed the whole thing around Mahatma Gandhi. He wasn't out there talking to politicians, he was out there talking to the people. And if there's ever an issue that needs the people, it's children and how they're raised in this country. Because we have stories like Shannon Kustachin that position this on our watch. There are some Canadians out there who say this is not my issue because it happened 40, 50 years ago, even though the last residential school sadly only closed in 1996, not 40, 50 years ago. But for those of you who believe that, well, this is your moment, this is your challenge. Shannon Kustachin is from the Attawapiskat First Nation, and when she was 5 years old in 2000, she was excited, like all other kids are, to go to kindergarten. You know, she had her little pencil crayons, but they were from the northern store, so they probably cost her parents about 20 bucks, where you can buy them down here at a lower price. But she was excited about the first day of school, except the only school in her community was closed because it sat on a toxic waste dump of over 30,000 gallons of diesel fuel. Now the government of Canada brings up portable trailers and puts them on the playground of that contaminated school. The distance from where Shannon as a 5-year-old would have went to kindergarten, and the contamination is no further from me to the back corner, separated only by a chain link fence. It's no wonder that the children will all tell you that in the spring you can smell the diesel as the as the snow melts and the earth unthaws. It was supposed to be a temporary measure. 3 ministers of Indian Affairs promised change. None of them delivered, over 2 different political parties. The children, during all these years, had decided to support the leadership and send letters themselves. They thought maybe the people in Ottawa, if they knew how bad it was, they would help us. Because these portables are getting so run down now, the heat goes up regularly. There are mice eating your snacks, so you have to guard them at the door. So these are our guards here. If there's any mice, you're in charge in the back. You know, it's kind of like you're on Air Canada, but you have to give the kids the emergency briefing, right? This is what we do when we see a rat running past, right? Things were getting deplorable. There is no library, there was no science equipment, there is no computer. How many people would have been here at the University of Manitoba if you went to a school without a computer and without a library? You know, I get so frustrated when I see things like mentorship posters for First Nations kids. Because what it does is it assumes that if I can do it, you can do it. But you got to do it with a library and science equipment and a school without rats and sitting on a contamination dump, and that's what we expect these kids to overcome. But Shannon, by the time she's in grade 8, these promises were still not broken, so she reached out with YouTube and she sent a YouTube video out into the universe asking non-Aboriginal children to write letters as well. Maybe if they wrote letters, the government would pay attention, she thought. And thankfully, thousands of non-Aboriginal children joined into the campaign. In fact, Charlie Angus talks about going to New Westminster into an elementary school, and there's a little guy there, and he's wearing his best shirt and a tie. And he's there meeting him, he says, I just want to introduce myself. I am the chairperson of the Attawapiskat School Committee. Meanwhile, back at Indian Affairs, they're getting all these letters in from children. Now, what do you do about that? You can't just send out a form letter to kids, or can you? Well, one of the children who got a letter was a 10-year-old, and she is from Toronto, and she had written a letter asking why this inequality exists, what's happening with these First Nations kids. It didn't make sense to her. Her school had fundraised for schools in Africa, and they even seemed in some cases better off than what she was hearing. So she's waiting, and her name is Clara. She's waiting for the Prime Minister to write back, and eventually he does, and a big envelope arrives. And she rips it open, and inside is a 4x6 autographed picture of our Prime Minister. Nice. Now we all were wondering where they could make a few cuts, along with the penny. So anyway, and a letter was in there, but it said nothing more than we're happy to hear from young people. Well, that didn't impress this 10-year-old. And so she took it back to see all of her other kids in the class and said, this is what's happening to these poor kids in Attawapiskat who are trying to learn, and this is what I got back. Well, the other kids were just appalled. They asked me to come and speak. And I have to say, and I don't mean any disrespect to you as faculty or students at university, but you don't ask as good a questions as 10-year-olds. And so they said, what do you do if you write a letter to the Prime Minister and he doesn't write back? That's a good question, right? No university student has asked me that. And then I got handcuffed because I pride myself on being a pretty quick talker, sometimes irrelevantly so, but I get my words out. And this one little boy puts up his hand, he says, I have an important question. Do people vote Conservative because they give them tax cuts? So I'm still trying to think of the answer for that. But you can see Shannon inspired a whole generation of children to know what it means to stand on guard for the country when we sing that line in the national anthem. I think one of my greatest sadnesses is we don't teach children, young people, how to stand up in respectful ways. And this girl modeled that. Halfway through her grade 8 year, she gets a letter from the Conservative government. It could have been from the Liberal government, though, because the Liberal government also did this. We are not going to fund your school. So she goes down with 2 other young people to see Minister Stroll, the Conservative minister at the time. Again, it could have been a Liberal minister, because they did it too. And in a Globe and Mail quote of the week, she said, I think he was nervous. And we all think so too. Because, I don't know, they need to do a workshop in Ottawa about how to deal with 13-year-olds, I think, for the MPs. That should be part of the orientation, right? So he walks into the office and he points out how big his office is. It sits right on the Ottawa River. And she said, yes, it is really nice, and I wish it was this warm for those of us trying to learn up in Ottawapiskat. And then, you know, as ministers do, they look at their watches, right? They've got other places to be. They're important people with busy schedules. And he was starting to warm up to say how busy he was, and he was moving on to something else. And I guess, you know, Shannon must have thought, well, she's busy too, so let's just get down to the business here. So are you going to fund a school or not? And he said, no, I can't afford it. And she rises up and she shakes the minister's hand. She said, thank you for spending time with us today, but I don't believe you. And I will never give up, because school is a time for dreams and every kid deserves this. That's her on the House of Parliament saying exactly what she said to the minister just 2 hours after that meeting with Chuck Stroll. And she was as good as her word. She went out and she talked to anyone who would listen about the importance of school, because by this time she knew about Manitoba, the school with the snakes. She knew about black mold contamination in schools throughout the country. She knew that many kids, schools are so overcrowded, children are going to school in shifts. She knew even if you had a good school, you're underfunded by $2,000 to $3,000 a year, and you're probably going to graduate about 2 years behind grade level than all other people. So it made no sense to her. She was going to give it up until the end. And she was nominated at the age of 14 for the International Children's Peace Prize given out by the Nobel laureates. One of only 45 kids in the world to be receiving that honor. When she was 13, she had to move hundreds of miles away from her loving family and community just to go to school. It saddened me when I saw the news on Ottawapiskat that no one talked that this particular community had raised a child who had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for kids. There's something right happening there. And she goes and she stands in the hallway of this school, and she goes just off to a classroom, and it was a fairly run-down school. And tears started flowing down her face. One of the rare times that Shannon cried. And when she was asked why she was crying, she said, I wish I had my life to live over again so I could go to a school as nice as this. It's only months later that she died in a car accident on her way to school hundreds of miles from her family. Her sister Serena, to this day, has on her arm a tattoo that says, see you soon, which was the last words that Shannon said to her before this beautiful hero passed away, never knowing what it is to be treated equally by the government of Canada. That was 2010. Within 24 hours of her passing, the First Nations and non-Aboriginal children she inspired created a Facebook page called Shannon's Dream to memorialize their friend, but also to say that they were going to continue their work, that they too would never give up until every First Nations child had a safe and comfy school and equitable education. Yesterday, the budget announcement is one small drop in that bucket. But the kids are not going to give up because Shannon's dream has not been realized. Shannon's dream was not so that a little bit of equality would be realized, and not just so that some kids would have a safe and comfy school. It was for them all. And of course, we all know the story of Jordan River Anderson from here from Norway House Cree Nation. A boy that was left to live and grow up in a hospital because of who he was. At the age of 2, he should have been discharged from hospital after spending the first 2 years there for medical reasons. If he was non-Aboriginal, he would have been discharged. The fact he was First Nations, though, triggered a dispute. Manitoba will pay for health care for all others, but they want the feds to pay for it on reserve. So they looked over to the feds when Jordan was ready for discharge, and the feds said, oh, well, we're not too sure we want to pay for this. And even if we do, we got all these different departments, and we're not sure who here is responsible. And the province didn't want to pick up a federal cost, and the federal government didn't want to pick up a provincial cost. And so they left the baby in the hospital while they argued over who should pay. Can you imagine if you're that parent? It's the child's race that is starting this. Nothing you can do will ever change that. Your child is not going home because of their race. The parents tried, the community tried, the Assembly of Manitoba chiefs tried, the doctors and the nurses tried, but they screamed into silence as these bureaucracies said they were meeting one more time. And sadly, Jordan River Anderson died not far from here in Winnipeg Children's Hospital in 2005 after spending 2.5 years there waiting for the government to do the right thing. Those who know Jordan well say that he died of a broken heart. And his family asked nothing more than this not to happen to another child. And that's where Jordan's principle comes from. Jordan's principle says where government service is available to all others, and one of these disputes crops up, the government of first contact, in this case Manitoba or Canada, pays for it and then argues about reimbursement later. It's a very simple principle of equality. It was passed through the House in 2007, but when it was, Ernest Anderson, Jordan's dad, said, "Do not let the good being done to my son's name today just be a moral victory." He's not interested in moral victories. He's interested in change. So what did the government of Canada do when they passed Jordan's principle? Well, they immediately began to create something called the federal response to Jordan's principle that had the effect of narrowing it to only to children with complex medical needs and multiple service providers. And what makes me even more, I guess, uncomfortable with their response is they said they did that for Jordan because that's what he had. They started with them. And they're rationalizing the inequality that exists in other areas. Now, I'm going to ask you to sign up for Jordan's principle and wear his pin, but I thought you might be interested in what the internal government documents say, because often they say one thing to us in public, but for access to information, you can find the documents of what they really say on the inside. And you can see here, we don't know when it's dated, because Canada sometimes does not date its documents, in my view, to escape access to information requests. But this says, you know, we've not found situations where the federal government has become found liable because of child fatalities and child deaths. So you can see here that they clearly know what's happening. They clearly know the harm, and their concern is more about liability, it appears, than about the children themselves. And Marina Beadle will tell you that it doesn't even apply to children with complex medical needs, and you need not even go to Nova Scotia to hear that, because we have families right here, Harriet Prudhomme-Smith from Manitoba, and many other families who will tell you what's happening right here too, where even those children are being denied these services. The Minister of Indian Affairs in 2010, in November, was before the Aboriginal Affairs Committee and claims there are no Jordan's principle cases. Let me just ask the group here. Who knows of a child that's being denied a government service because of race or is being delayed the receipt of that? Does anybody in this room know anybody? Yeah. So, you know, we should invite the minister here because we found 4 right away, right? And that's true across the country. But what happens with Marina, and you can see her in this picture, she's an elder from the Pictou Landing First Nation, and she's a single mom of 2 boys. One is 20, Jonathan, and this is Jeremy. And Marina would want you to know about Jeremy that he loves music and he loves the powwow drum. But he also had hydrocephalus and was cerebral palsy and autism, which creates severe self-harming behaviors, especially when he's in unfamiliar surroundings. Now, with almost no support, because families who have children with special or different needs and disabilities officer know how challenging that can be, but this is even less than that. She parents him until he's 15 years of age. But then, and she told me, she said, I always slept lightly because I was afraid Jeremy would wake up in the middle of the night and he would need me, and I wanted to hear him. But then Marina has a double stroke, so severe that she cannot walk and she cannot hold a water glass. Her first thought is, oh my gosh, what am I going to do when Jeremy calls for me in the middle of the night and I cannot get up to help him? Well, that's where Jordan's principle comes in. You see, off reserve in Nova Scotia, there's a base amount of in-home care of $2,500 or $2,200 a month, plus an exceptional circumstances clause that Jeremy would have met all the criteria for. So Marina drew a breath of relief and thought this was going to be okay after all. But Canada then says, we're going to provide you the $2,200, but we're not going to top it up with the exceptional circumstances. And they say in an email, they're outlining the options for the family, and they say, well, you can take the $2,200 a month, and the First Nation could top it up. And this is a small community without a lot of revenue, but they are doing that anyway, but they've said, well, we can't continue to do it, we're just going to run out of money. They said, well, you can do it that way. Or if they do run out of money, which is what Marina's afraid of, and then there won't be anyone there to care for her and Jeremy, then things might deteriorate to such a level that child welfare would get involved. And then the federal government will pay for child welfare intervention. And if you don't like those 2 options, they will pay to put him in an institution hundreds of miles away from his family. Who here is a Canadian taxpayer, regardless of what political affiliation you have, would have objected to your tax dollars being used to support Jeremy at home? I have not found one Canadian taxpayer across the country who would have objected to that. But the Canadian government was firm, and so what did Marina do? She took them to court. She alleged that the not implementing Jordan's principle was a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so what a courageous but unnecessary step in 2011. I found myself in Halifax, and I met Marina Beadle, and she was coming up the walk with a walker. Still not okay. She could hold, she was proud. She said, I could hold on to a plate if it's a paper plate, but still the ones that are glass are too heavy. You can just sense her power and her strength and her wisdom. She was being cross-examined by Canada's lawyers that day. The same lawyers who fought against many of the residential school survivors in the Atlantic were now reprofiled for this case. And I know that's their legal right to do it, but something in me, just from a human level, thought that was really not okay. How can our government put a woman who just went through a double stroke, through the stress of a cross-examination, and possibly believe that's what Canadians want? Well, that court case is going to be heard on the 12th in Halifax, or 11th and 12th in Halifax, and you can find all the court documents there, and also the access to information documents that include that email chain I just talked to you about. But that, of course, is only one element of the inequalities. You need to understand that these inequalities are not just in education or not just in child welfare. They pile up on the hopes and dreams of kids across dimensions. And one of the big areas of inequality is child welfare funding. And where is the inequality? In terms of providing funds for prevention to deal with the big drivers. So First Nations kids are about 6 to 8 times more likely to go into child welfare care nationally than non-Aboriginal kids. There's 3 times the number of First Nations kids in child welfare than there was at the height of residential school. Why? Poverty, poor housing, and substance misuse. All things we could do something about if there was adequate resources, which there are not. You need only read Canada's own documents. You know, I was reading the budget yesterday, and there's nothing in there for child and family services. This is their own briefing note again. This is actually, I believe, is a briefing note for the minister who's about to appear in front of a parliamentary committee. So you can see their circumstances are dire. Now that they're talking about First Nations children here, keep this in mind, and probably arguably some of the most vulnerable children. As a consequence of providing inadequate prevention resources, it's foreseeable civil proceedings could be initiated against Canada as a result of neglect or abuse of children in care. How is this possibly in the interest of Canadians? I just don't understand, right? So in 2007, with the support of First Nations agencies all across this country who could tell you they could be doing a far better job if the structure of funding was based on children and if the funding was equitable, along with the Assembly of First Nations, I was walking out of Parliament with then National Chief Bill Fontaine. Many of you know him here from Manitoba. It was a beautiful and bright sunny day. And I was walking out, and we had just filed a human rights complaint against the Canadian government for racially discriminating against First Nations children by underfunding child welfare services. This was 2007. There was nobody there. A case that should have reverberated in the consciousness of the nation, and there was nobody there. But all of that has changed, and we can talk about that in a minute. This is a campaign we started along with the court case. It's called I Am a Witness. And what we did is we load up all of Canada's court documents, all of ours, and we don't ask people to take a side. We ask people to watch. Read all of their documents, read all of our documents, and then make up your own mind as to whether this is okay for the Canadian government to be treating children that way. Now, you should know that Canada is not arguing this case on the merits, on the facts. They aren't trying to defend themselves on whether they discriminate or not. In my view, that's because there's lots of evidence that they are discriminating, including their own document, Auditor General's reports, and all kinds of other things. So what are they trying to do? Get off it on this government that puts out the accountability banner is trying to get out of this on a legal loophole. They're saying to Canadians, here are the questions we want you to focus on. Forget about this other thing with the kids. This is the most important question. Provincial child welfare services are funded by the provinces. We, the federal government, only fund these folks on reserve. It wouldn't be fair to us, would it, to compare the provincial funding with the federal funding? Who here thinks that's a more important argument? Okay, well, maybe you'll be convinced by their second, because they have two. So the second argument is, we are not doing the actual discrimination. All we do is we fund persons like this who are on reserve service agencies. Now, your group here, your community members, are noticing that just across the street, these folks are getting a lot more. Well, you're free to decide how you want to use that money, which isn't true, by the way, but I'm going to say that. You're free to decide how you're using your money. So they really should be taking the discrimination claim up with you, not with me. Now the problem with that is that there's no way you could remedy the discrimination. You likely agree that the people across the road are doing better. I'm the only one who can do that. So that's what Canada's doing, and we have actually over 9,000, close to 10,000, and hopefully with Manitoba we can push that to 10,000. People watching the case. It's actually a really good case for social work and law students, because you can watch a live case going on the thing. Now, Canada tried to convince the federal court on 2 occasions for this legal loophole and were turned down. And so in 2009, we were all ready to go on a hearing on the merits. And one of the things, I'll give some pride to my profession of social workers, they couldn't find one social worker. There are 17,000 licensed social workers in Canada. Canada could not find one of them to testify on their behalf. So it was going to be an interesting hearing on the merits, needless to say. But the government appointed a brand new tribunal chair to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And within 4 days of her appointment, she vacated all the hearing dates on the merits. There's a conference call with all the council. No one had applied for this. Not even Canada had applied for it. And she asked Canada why they have not brought a motion to dismiss on those 2 technical issues we just talked about. Not surprisingly, they do bring such a motion. And it's heard in June of 2010. And this is the actual ruling here. Now, she agrees with the comparator issue. She says, oh no, it's not fair to Canada to compare federal and provincial funding. Even though there's a Supreme Court decision that says, yeah, it is actually fair, and you don't even need a comparator. But that's another argument. But the one thing that kind of worries me a bit here is, upon extensive reflection of the complainants groups, that would be ourselves and AFN and the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and the Commission is on our side, so don't confuse them with the tribunal. I note the preferential interpretation of the complainant group, that being, we were saying, it's impossible to compare First Nations people on reserve. We didn't create these reserves. Canada created these reserves. There aren't First Nations people on reserve or non-Aboriginal people on reserves off reserve. Like, it's just crazy. So that's what we're saying, it's crazy, it shouldn't be used. I note the preferential interpretation would result in potentially incongruous and illogical ramifications for First Nations children, or First Nations themselves. It read to me as if she was trying to save us from ourselves, kind of thing, right? This kind of stuff you'd expect to read in the 1900s, but I was a bit shocked, I think, to say that it was in 2011. So we have appealed that case, and we're in federal court on February 13th to 14th, and many of our First Nations agencies and non-Aboriginal allies were there. In fact, there were over 200 kids there every single day. Now you might wonder, now imagine yourself as Canada's lawyers, or Canada's legal counsel, or the people directing them. It's okay, people are used to being badly behaved in front of adults. But imagine yourself having to carry off that case in front of a group of kindergarten kids. Now your only hope is that they don't understand what's going on. So I go out and there's this little girl, and she's 5 years old. And they're sitting there having their granola bars, because you know that's what kids do. And she said, I have a question. Why are they talking about everything except for children? So she clearly got it. Right? And then there was but then you can try to hope that the grade 5 kids don't get it, right? There's a little guy out there, and you know those reporters' notebooks that go this way? Well, the teacher had bought them all reporters' notebooks, so they could be real witnesses, right? And so he had drawn a line down the center of the page, and you know the tallies, like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have a whole list of those on one side, and then maybe about a third of the page on the other side. And he said, I just want to tell you, this is what I've been doing in there. And it was the day when lawyers were talking. He said, the long list is when the judge asks Canada a question, and the short list is when they answer. So we're still waiting your ruling on that. Actually, it should be any moment we'll get that ruling. And that case will have precedent setting for equality across education, health, policing, all kinds of different areas. So it's really important that you watch that case. And of course, in the background, we have this scenario happening. And I just raised this because I think it's really important to understand. that tall trees catch a lot of wind. That sometimes just doing something as basic as equality for kids can put you under the microscope of the Canadian government. So I have, I don't know how many thousands of pages where they're following me to talks. They are looking at my personal Facebook page. If I'm not at a talk, they send notes saying she's not at this talk. This is what the paper is. We've referred it to justice. We want to know if we can go to talk about liability or, you know, to all these kinds of crazy things. Now, they also, my status record appears in those documents on at least 5 different occasions. And that has the name of my grandparents, and my parents, and my brother and sister, and me, and all the rest of it, right? Now, there are actually 165 at least different public officials involved in this. All at the most senior levels of government. So we're not talking to grassroots person. We're talking to most senior levels of government within the Department of Justice and the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. And when I looked at that, I thought a couple of things. Number one, is this really what a security risk looks like? I mean, I'm size 6, I don't even have a parking ticket, let alone a criminal record. And they're spending this kind of money on me? I felt a little bit liberated when I found out about the elder in Montreal who had surveillance outside of his home because he was feeding squirrels too many peanuts. I thought, well, yeah, I guess this is where we're at. But then the second question is how much money is being wasted on this that could be going to the kids, right? So that's a side issue. The real issue is the kids, but I think it's important that we all think about how democratic and free our society really is. And so you might be wondering what those children who promised Chanakustachin they were never going to give up have been up to. Well, this is February 14th. And this is at just outside the court here. And all of these children are assembled. Now the children are so smart. They said, not all of us can go over to have a heart day. Some of us have to stay in the court. So some of them are there. Now they have all written valentines to the Prime Minister. And these valentines are for First Nations children to have the same opportunity to grow up safely in their families, be healthy, go to good schools, and be proud of who they are. And I must say 3 cheers for Southeast Child and Family, who sent in 5,000 valentines from here in Manitoba. So they are the winners of the biggest group for sending in valentines. But these are the kids. Now, I just want to point out something for those of you in political science. Those wearing red are not members of the Liberal Party. That's not a Conservative member. And over there with the toque is not an NDPer. They are all there because they understand that this is simply not fair. Now, they had letters to read out to the Prime Minister that day. And you might be wondering kind of what they had to say, right? I mean, what do little kids get about this, right? You know there's a saying that it's so easy a child can get it, right? Well, they do get it, right? And they stand up there at the microphone, and there's Elliot. And he's got a toque on and a green coat. And you can watch him online on our I Am a Witness website. Dear Prime Minister Harper, I do not understand why you are over in China criticizing their human rights when you cannot do the right thing back here at home. And then there's a little girl, and she steps up and she says, Dear Prime Minister Harper, I think you need to go back to grade 5. Because that's where you learn about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And my teacher says that means you have to treat everybody fairly. And you're not doing that, so you're breaking your own laws. So you need to go back to grade 5 and learn more about it. And a year before that, the one that inspired them was another group of children, and there's a little guy named Harry, and he had written this letter, and he had actually wondered. He wasn't sure he wanted to write a letter because he says, no one reads my letters anyway. So he gets his paper out there, and he writes to Stephen Harper. He says, Dear Stephen Harper, do you have a cat? I have a cat. His name is Micah, and he's a boy and he's black. And Stephen Harper, of course, has lots of cats, because his wife is the chairperson of the SPCA fur ball every day, right? So, but then he gets right down to business. He says, Stephen Harper, listen to me. By the way, I have an agenda here. I want the University of Manitoba to give this kid an honorary doctorate degree. Because what I'm about to tell you has much more reason than some of the dissertations I've read all over the world, right? So here we go. Stephen Harper, listen to me. if you do not build more schools, you're going to create a crime wave and lose all of your money. Because kids who cannot go to school cannot get jobs, and they're still going to need money. So some of them are going to have to steal it. And then people in the community are going to get mad because crooks are invading their homes. And since you're in charge, you're going to have to fix this mess. So you should man up right now, build more schools, love Harry. That's how long dissertations should be. We all in this room could come up with a gazillion citations to back up what Harry has to say. So these kids are up there, and all together across Canada, by the way, there's about 20,000 Valentines we estimate sent in. And one of the most moving stories was there's a group of children who, with disabilities, as well as that's beside another school of children. And so the children who could write would write the Valentines out, and the other children who had gifts in different ways would color in the hearts of the Valentines. And so we had children of all different types. And there was a group of persons, of adults with disabilities who came to the hearing, non-Aboriginal folks. And after they had a little bit of a circle about what they learned. And one of the adults said, you know, the government even pays for us to go to school until we're 21. You know, no Canadian who's been confronted with the opportunity to learn about this thinks this is okay. And that's our greatest hope. Now, I have asked you to do 3 things. I've asked you to sign up to be a witness, sign up for Jordan's Principle, and sign up for Shannon's Dream. But some of you are going to wimp out and not do those things. So I'm going to guilt you into it by talking about Wesley. Now, you can see Wesley here has not, does not have a university degree. I know that's going to surprise you, but he's not there yet. But he's in this picture and he's 11 years old, and you can see who his hero is by his t-shirt, right, which he made himself. You can see there, Shannon Coustachin, right over his heart. Now, his dad told him about all the conditions in Attawapiskat, the fact that there's no water, people have buckets for toilets and all these things. He could not believe it. So he says at the dinner table, we need to do something. That's his motto, do something. And I agree, that's where adults fall down. We don't do something, we wring our hands with worry, and then we don't do anything. But kids do something. So, 2 years later, Wesley is up in Attawapiskat building a playground for the kids in Attawapiskat. But here's the rest of the story. He had raised the $90,000 to build that playground all on his own. First thing he does is he understands that people in Attawapiskat are living in tents. He said, well, you know, it doesn't get this cold down here, but one thing I can do is get our tent and put it out there at the Niagara Falls campground, and people will pledge dollars for however long I'm there. And the radio station shows up, and this is the wonderful role of media, shows up, and he ends up raising $6,000. And then, is there anyone here in business or in management schools? No? All right, we keep this secret. This is our little secret here. So Wesley decides he's going to go to a corporation in his area that makes toys. He says, you know, look, I'm raising funds for playgrounds for First Nations communities. Will you match dollar for dollar whatever I make? I don't know what the CEO had in his mind, but I'm thinking, you know, what the heck, what is a couple car washes, right? Well, then Wesley wins $25,000. And corporate Canada keeps its promise. Now, there's a problem with being an 11-year-old fundraiser, and that is that you have to go to school in September. And he wanted to be up there to build the playground with the community members over the summer. But the barge carrying all the equipment was delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. And he was getting so worried because then he'd got to go back to school and wouldn't be able to be there to help. But by some miracle, the barge leaves right around his birthday. So on his birthday, he's standing on the river in Attawapiskat, and there are Jenny and Andrew, Shannon's parents. And he says, are you here to wait for the playground equipment? And they were. They had actually organized a whole birthday party for Wesley, celebrate what he had done, the whole community did. But they said, we're also here for something else because in our tradition, we have a memorial ceremony for our child a year after their passing. And we had a very special marker made for Shannon. And we were really worried because if the barge would have left at the time when it was leaving, her marker wasn't ready. But for some miracle, we said to Wesley, the barge was delayed. We were so thankful. And it kept on being delayed and delayed and delayed until the very day when that marker was ready. So Shannon had come up on the same barge with the playground equipment. That was 2 months before the Red Cross ever got mobilized. And I think we're still waiting in many cases for the Government of Canada to do, because Joe Wesley did not walk into that community with judgment. He walked into that community with help. Now, I'm going to ask you to do something else, and that is to have a walk. We're going to steal the idea from the children, and you're going to build your own mailbox here at the University of Manitoba. You are going to go onto the Our Dreams Matter 2 Walk website, and you're going to write your letters so that every First Nations child get a chance to grow up safely at home, be healthy, be proud of who they are, and go to good schools. Then you're going to register your number of walkers and your number of letter writers on a national website. We are going to have a big walk in Ottawa on June 11th. And the kids are going to be there again. So don't embarrass yourselves by just having 5 people out there with signs. This is Manitoba. Come on, folks, right? You got to show the kids in Ottawa that you actually know how to do this stuff. Now, what the kids in Ottawa did is they built a school out of paper mache. And they said they did that because they read a Canadian Geographic magazine that said in the 10 years when Attawapiskat was waiting for a school, Canada had built 75 schools in Afghanistan. Something they should have done, but it makes you wonder why they weren't doing it there. And they also said, look, we did this in an afternoon, it's not that hard. We don't know why these adults can't get their act together and get it done.
I'll interrupt you for just one moment, I'm very sorry. Is there somebody in the room by the name of Robert Roulette? I just have to call it an emergency. I'm very sorry.
No, that's fine. So, some of you are not that imaginative. So I'm about to provide you with some inspiration from the kids about how to write these letters. And in the background, you're going to hear a song written by a University of Saskatchewan law student called Mariva Farrell Reset, who wrote a song called I Am a Witness. I am a witness, I am a sentinel. I can see everything you're trying to hide. Wesley calls his organization northernstarfish.org, and I asked him as a BC girl, why do you call it starfish? Because there are no starfish in Niagara Falls and none in Attawapiskat. And he said it was because of the adults. He said, when I told them I was going to do something, a lot of adults told me I was just a kid. That these were big problems and somebody else should be taking care of. That I had lots of things to do, like going to the playground and doing all these things, and why would I even bother? And I started to wonder. And then his dad told him a story about starfish, and maybe you know it too. Where a little boy walks up onto a beach and there's all kinds of starfish that have washed up. And as children naturally do, they don't stand there and think we need a logic model for throwing them back in. They tend to just bend down and get to it. And that's what he was doing. And a man come along, and it could have well been a woman, and said, why are you even bothering? Haven't you looked at how many are there? There's no way you can possibly save them all. And the little boy for the first time looked up and he saw that there were so many. Before he saw one by one, and now he looked at the vastness of it and it felt overwhelming. What could one person possibly do? Maybe he's right, maybe I should go play. Maybe I should go do other things. But there's something wonderful about children, where love and spirituality just emanate from him, and even as if, without any reason, he finds his knees bending, and he picks up another starfish and he throws it back to the ocean so that it might live. And he looks back at the man and he says, there, I just saved that one. 20 years from now, people will ask you if you knew what was happening to First Nations children in 2012, and you did. And was there something that you could have done? Yes, there was. Did it cost a lot of money? No, it cost nothing. Did it take a lot of your time? Did you have to bring out another campaign or volunteer for another committee? And it did. It's under 2 minutes. And did you do anything? The next time you sing "O Canada, I Stand on Guard for Thee," I hope you can say like Wesley and sing it with all its meaning. Because if you do nothing, please skip that line altogether. Because you don't know how to stand on guard for what is truly fundamental to the human existence of fairness, justice, and equality and privilege. And the children are showing us how to do it. So with that, I look forward to coming to the Our Dreams Matter 2 walk here at the University of Manitoba. And I thank you for your time.
We're going to take around 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has questions, please go ahead.
Yeah?
Yes. Excellent presentation. You just so natural. I taught at the Thunderchild Indian Reserve Day School in the early 50s, like 6 decades ago. And it was not a residential school. And I actually taught the kindergarten to grade 5. And just a wonderful experience for those Nathis and species. Tremendous. Excuse my Cree, it's probably not accurate. But we had situations where we had a home ec teacher coming in 1 week a month, and a woodwork kind of person. So we took advantage of that, and we had the kids actually prepare the Friday meal. We took our own initiative. We encouraged, being a farm boy, I taught them how to dig a spade and plant a broccoli, and they started that. So I mean, there are things we can do because money itself doesn't solve the problem. We had also lifestyle in those days was different too. We used to run and hike in the fjords because we lived near a town called Turtleford, and we were looking for turtles. Get it?
You know,
can you just make a brief, going back 6 decades ago, any comment regarding, is it better, worse, or indifferent, or whatever?
Where I think it's, when I look back from residential schools and I look towards today, I don't see any improvement in Canada's behavior. I think there's real duplications to the way the government of Canada responded during residential schools and the way they're responding now. Where I see a lot of difference is between 2007, when I walked out and I saw no one, to 2012, when there was at least 500 little kids out there with their signs and singing songs and doing things. caring Canadians we're no longer alone. We're no longer alone. You know, and the issue about money doesn't solve everything, I always listen with a keen ear as to when Canada says that. They never throw that out, for example, when they're talking about funding their fighter jets. Money doesn't solve everything in fighter jets. They don't put that out there when they're talking about hosting the G8 and blowing $1 billion to there. Money doesn't solve everything. It always comes when it's actually addressing a harm that they're doing. There was a great mediator from Australia, and he was talking about the whole idea of why don't you just get over it, how that comes up in domestic violence situations or a lot of other things. And he says, there's the old speech, well, why aren't you just getting over it? And he said, you know, look, I've been a mediator for 30, 40 years. The person who does the harm is always the one who gives that speech. He said, and it's fair enough to say that you need to move forward. But Wilma Gus, who's an elder who provided a lot of guidance to me, she's on the Cowichan tribes. She said, when you screw up, your first job is not to apologize. It's to learn. It's to understand what you have done wrong, but you don't get to decide that as the person who did the wrong, because you don't know what the harm was. You need to leave that. That's the property of the person on the other side, or the group on the other person. You need to hear from them what happened. And then in that way you make a commitment to not do it again. And that's where I don't see Canada having learned. I don't see that it's learned. If it learned from residential schools, then why would it be fighting Marina Beetle? Like that, I don't understand. Or why would it be fighting against us where we're trying to just get equality for kids in child welfare care? There's nothing for the Caring Society or AFN in this judgment. If we're successful in this case, we will not get a dime. And that is as it should be. It should all go to the children. So that's where I see some of the differences.
I got a comment and a question. First comment, just to respond to, you know, yesterday I was online donating some money for some charity. You know what, and even though money doesn't, you know, solve everything, at the end of the day, money is a sign of some commitment care, you know, and as I was typing how much I want to donate, you know, I had to stop myself or encourage myself to do more. So I think it's when you look at the budget and looks at the billings and where they're going, it's a good sign of what priorities the government has. And another comment is on the whole comparability argument. And I would support the comparability argument and say, you know what, the First Nations communities have more needs.
Yeah.
Therefore, you shouldn't actually treat them as the same as, you know, the community where there's infrastructure and schools and everything is set up. You should provide more support because you like be needs-based in that regard. So that's my argument on comparability, and I don't know, I have a question too. So.
All right, I agree with you on comparability. In fact, the courts have agreed on it too. Is that equal doesn't mean equal. So, for example, like let's just put it onto a grassroots thing. Say if I'm in a municipality and I'm in a building and it's falling apart with me, and every homeowner gets a $100 grant. And next door to me, as I have a guy who is living in a house with a nice pool and everything else, you know, $100 is not going to do a lot for me, right? Probably means more to me than it does to him, but he's already well ahead of the game, right? So the courts have recognized substantive equity, and especially when it comes to children. We're saying that we want all children to get into the race. And where money matters is getting every kid to the starting line on an equal basis. And after that, yeah, there's all kinds of differences that happen. But every kid deserves an equal shot. Some kids shouldn't be told to pull up their bootstraps harder or do more just simply because of their race. That's not the way Canada was founded. So everybody should start off with an equal chance to success. But that success might look different depending on their culture and your needs. And the courts have recognized that. What's your question?
And my question is, lately we talk a lot about culturally appropriate or culturally based and culturally sensitive services, and I find that sometimes not even, you know, First Nations friends of mine know what culturally based stands for. You know, we think that, you know, if we put a little drum, you know, or dream catcher in our offices, suddenly we turn our service into culturally appropriate. So I would like to hear what's your view of the culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive service.
Well, you know what I'm still on the lookout for, and maybe you can help me, is I want to see how do I make a non-Aboriginal service culturally appropriate. Like, you know, they take our services and they throw in a dream catcher and call it culturally appropriate. So what do? Do we kind of take them out to the sweat house and then we throw in a, I don't know, what would be kind of the archetype of Western society? A Facebook page. And therefore it's culturally appropriate to them. We totally minimize the worldview going into it. And I've written a lot on that, talking about that. And where I differentiate it in my own language is culturally appropriate to me is very often trivial. It was well-intentioned, but it's trivial. And what I say is culturally based is actually working from the worldview of the people in that culture. And understanding that no service is culturally neutral. Like child welfare and health, etc., education, universities, all have an accent. But those who share that culture can't hear it. It's just like me when I travel. I've been to over 50 countries in the world, and I think I'm the only person on the planet that does not have an accent. I sound the same to myself no matter where I go. Right? Do you ever notice that? And if people say I have an accent, and especially if they say I sound like a Texan, then I start to have a little bit of a dialogue with them. And I say, no, I sound exactly the same way I do at home, and I've been talking about this way a long time. But everybody else has an accent where I go. And that's why for Aboriginal students coming to the University of Manitoba, you have a heavy accent. You can't see it. And it's not enough just to develop a native center or do all these things. You need to fundamentally look at the worldview from the perspective of the people that are there and value that knowledge as on equal footing with Western knowledge. You know, I don't understand why we're giving out Nobel Prizes to physics theorists for the theory of everything. You know, they built the Hadron Collider and everything else. And that whole thing, for example, is just starting to understand in Western science that multiple dimensions of reality are probable. Well, Indigenous peoples have known that for thousands of years. They're still just starting to get on the edge of where everything is connected in the gene, you know, just a few genetic twists and then you could be a fish. Well, the Indigenous people have known that for thousands of years. We should be stacking that Nobel Prize thing for the next 50, 60 cycles and making up for time, because they're just catching up to us on some of this level. But also Western science, Western worldview, has got some things that are much better explored using that perspective. So it's not about needing to put them on a hierarchy. It's about understanding that we can get at some of the biggest questions that have beguiled Western science and Western thinking by embracing some of the worldviews of Indigenous peoples and other cultures around the world.
I just wanted to make a comment that I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to view your presentation. You know, I can relate to a lot of the issues that you speak of. Like, I come from a northern community that was contaminated by PCBs from Manitoba Hydro, and our community had actually just recently voted to take a settlement from the government, which was $17 million. You know, and for us, you know, that are out here, like, my children pay attention to what's going on back home, but this has been going on from way back in the 50s. When Manitoba Hydro had the field there, and our school was torn down because of the contamination under the school, and then they couldn't go to school there, then they had to go to school in trailers, which she doesn't really remember because she was probably just in kindergarten then. So now we had to negotiate with the provincial government for us to get a new school. Even though all that circumstance, you know, situation was there, we still had to compete with other northern communities to get a new school. And year after year, we go as a school board, some members of us would go and put in forward our request and we'd say why we needed a new school, you know. And of course, like, finally they said, okay, well, it's your turn now, you can get a school. So now my children have that opportunity to attend the new school. And, you know, and it is true, like, the education system in the northern communities are years back, behind from the other schools, because my children are experiencing that now. Like, you know, they go to school here, but they're not at the grade level that they should be, so they have to work harder. And, you know, and of course, you know, they have to deal with the emotional aspect of the two, feeling, okay, well, what is wrong with me? You know, why is it this way? And we're working through that. You know, so anyhow, like, just seeing that being a reality for other communities, you know, and how our community chose to deal with it. Like, I'm not saying that, you know, was the proper solution to our situation, like, but for the people in our community, like, they were just tired of the, you know, delay and the legal process of it, and, you know, so anyway, they just decided to settle for the money. And where a lot of our elders, they said, you know what, you know, it shouldn't be about that. It's our land, it's our children, it's our health, and it's a lot deeper than the value of money. And so they're still going through, you know, there's still disputes and arguments about that, and I know that they will continue. And another thing that I'm reminded about is, you know, the child welfare system. You know, my family, I've experienced foster care as a child, and my children unfortunately experienced that also because of circumstances, you know. And when we were confronted with, you know, the child welfare system affecting them, you know, I was like, just the things that were going on, like, we said, okay, you know what, this sort of stuff is not supposed to be happening. So we did a march to Winnipeg a few years ago anyway, and I did an interview with a newspaper, and they wrote up my story and whatever. And then the day that I was to go to court, you know, the lawyers that came up would withdraw our, you know, they just withdrew and said, you have your kids back, you know. But I said, you know what, that's not going to make me be quiet about what it is that I want to talk about, you know, what the issues are in the child welfare system. So I said, you know what, you know, after the court was over that morning, like, we just started marching our way this way, you know, and I was given the opportunity to speak to the Minister of Child and Family Services, which was Mr. McIntosh at the time, and it was obvious that, you know, the people that were sitting in the higher position, like the Northern Authority on this end, and the office in the regional office, and there was a lack of communication, and there was a lot of stuff that was going on that shouldn't have been happening, and the children were suffering because of that, you know. But you know, it seemed like, okay, well, we weren't aware of that, or, you know, just that excuse, I guess, wasn't enough. And I said, what, you know, it shouldn't be that way. You know, it shouldn't be that the people that are holding an office to oversee a large area, a large number of people, you know, they should be knowledgeable about what is going on underneath them. And if they're not, you know, then somebody else should be up there. So I was very thankful that, you know, not to offend the people that lost their job, but I was thankful that, you know, other people were in position to oversee, because our children are very important. You know, they are, you know, the foundation. You know, they just are going to be our future, and we have to always hold them up and encourage them. And I know that, you know, the journey is not always perfect, but it's well worth it.
And you know, you're raising a really important point. That's one of the real tragedies of the inequality, and I've seen it time and time again. Is First Nations kids on reserve who are bright and capable and want to learn and want to do well. At some point they do internalize it. They think it must be, I mustn't be smart enough, I mustn't be trying hard enough, and that's why I'm not learning. When if you threw anybody into that situation, they'd be in that same scenario. And the problem is the system responds as if you were, you need extra help and all the rest of it. Instead of dealing with the underlying discrimination, it really is putting a weight on the feet of children. And I have so much admiration for the Shannon Coustachians of the world and the many non-First Nations kids across the country who are actually going to school at all, given these kinds of conditions. And we need to fundamentally go after that and put kids in the center of everything that we do and hold everybody accountable for doing the best we can. So I think that's it for me. I actually have to go to Portland, Oregon today and meet with our Native American friends. But I'll be around for a couple more minutes here around the end if anyone has any questions. And I just want to thank you all for coming.